while I was there was this group that was starting, called Chinatli. And I was like, what is Chinatli? And it was an indigenous group, that started there to really celebrate indigeneity. And so I had already attended a SACNAS conference by then. My community college Mesa program sent me to a SACNAS conference, even though we didn't have a chapter. And I attended actually my first semester at Berkeley, but was still paid for by my college, which was nice. And when I went to SACNAS, I'm not sure if have any of you already been to a SACNAS conference here?
Shasid has.
Okay. I remember that was the first place I went to.
Minerva.
Minerva did too? Okay. Was seeing all these other people that looked like me doing all this amazing work in science and engineering, and I was like, wow, this exists. And they were celebrating our culture while still celebrating their math and science and engineering careers. And it's quite different than SHEP, where SHEP is missing that cultural piece at times, I feel. But at SACNAS, it was up front and center that our culture matters, and that being able to uplift each other and being able to make sure that we all succeed was important. And my network was so many other people that looked like us. And it was such an eye-opening experience. And so when I finally saw this Chinatli group at UC Berkeley, I even got more curious. So what are your indigenous backgrounds? Are you also exploring your indigenous backgrounds? And you'll find the case that, because indigeneity has been robbed from us by so many hundreds of years ago, it's the case by many, where I
She started breaking up, Luis.
Okay, sorry about that. And I see it looks a little better. I think the heat here has been kind of affecting my internet a little bit. And so where I was going with that was that there's a difference between growing up indigenous and having an indigenous identity. So I never claimed to have that lived experience of growing up indigenous because, again, it's been robbed from my family. But I do now identify as indigenous because I have been welcomed. And again, I'll get there later. But that was the case for some of my classmates or people in the Chinatli group. It was a mixed group where some of them did grow up indigenous and some of them were also exploring their indigeneity and trying to get back to their roots. After Berkeley, I was in an engineering role for a while. I designed high precision pumps that pump anywhere from a pump that
I think it's happening again.
Yeah, did we lose them altogether?
Yeah. Is it better?
Yeah.
No, is it better without the video? Yeah,
it
okay.
is.
I just want to make sure that you could hear me more than see me. Okay, good. And so, again, I don't claim to ever have grown up indigenous, but I have finally explored that a little further. And I was going into my career in engineering, and I was designing pumps from kidney dialysis machines to milkshake machine at McDonald's, very high precision pumps. And when corporate in Illinois tried began micromanaging our engineering department, we were all unhappy. And at the time, I was already getting involved in higher ed, or involved with the Mesa programs and other programs around the Bay Area. And so I decided to look for engineering jobs and STEM education jobs. And I ended up applying to a Mesa coordinator position at Cal State East Bay, and I got the job. I ended up loving that job and ended up staying in education ever since. This was back in 2009. And I ended up going, after being at Cal State East Bay running their K-12 Mesa program, and helping run it, I ended up in Washington State, where I ran their K-12 Mesa program in the region I was at, outside of Yakima, as well as their community college Mesa program. And so that gave me the experience as an administrator in higher education. And so when I came back, I found out that my mentor and who held my position before me was retiring. And I was traveling at the time. I was in Nepal, traveling around the world between moving from Washington to California. And I found out that happened and that my colleague Rene was not applying because he didn't have a master's and it required a master's. And so I ended up applying and getting the job after all. And that brought me full circle back to Napa Valley College as our Associate Dean of Meson STEM programs. And so that's a little bit about that side of it. And my motivation for seeking my PhD came because I was seeing a lot of injustices. As many of you pointed out, there's a lot of injustices, not just in the community, but in higher education. And I also noticed that we weren't being represented in the higher positions. And so I envisioned myself moving up the ladder, vice president, and maybe president one day of my community college. Most of my colleagues are white in administration, and I know that representation matters. We need to be also step up and be those people representing our communities. I already have my master's in engineering management from Cal State East Bay because I was hoping to teach engineering. And I still hope to do that on the side every now and then. But right now I'm more focused on my PhD and moving up the administration ladder. And I want to tell you what I'm studying as well, because it's very relevant to what we're talking about here. So as I explored my indigeneity further, I felt that my community, Indigenous community, is what I wanted to focus my research on. And so I plan on researching with the Indigenous community to explore the experiences of Indigenous students whose roots are in what we call Mexico today. What does that mean? Like, so an Indigenous student, let's say, whether that student is Maya or Purepecha or Nahua, but they're here in our higher education system, be it at Santa Barbara Community College, Napa Valley College, UC Berkeley, whatever it may be, and be able to gather those stories to really explore what is affecting these students. Why are we not, we already know we're not serving the students well, but why are we not serving them well? What are we not doing well? And I'm also exploring the fact that they're living in a liminal space, like an in-between space as it relates to race and citizenship. Because many of these students are also undocumented. Many of the students don't have a box to check, right? Either they don't feel comfortable clicking the Native American box because that's usually been reserved for certain groups. Even though it's not the reality. The definition of Native American still includes the Americas overall. And some of them feel forced to click Hispanic because of their Mexican background as well. And so I'm kind of study that, like find out what is really going on there and how has this in-between space, as Gloria Anzaldúa, I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with her work, she describes this space as Nepantla. It's a Nahua word for in-between. And so I would highly encourage you to pick up some of her books if you're interested and hear more about that. Because in a way, a lot of us live in in-between space too. Como muchos dicen, ni de aquí ni de allá. Right. And so it's kind of like also like an in-between space that we currently live in, and we have to like navigate. And as an administrator of color, I also have to navigate that space of like code switching. Does everybody here know what code switching means? Anybody want to give it a try and explaining what it may mean? And it's okay to be wrong.
I can say something. It's when I talk to Luis and then we switch to a different language, or and they start talking in Espanol, and then we go back and forth. And we can also do that personally. Yeah. We can be, if we're in a different setting and we need to put on a certain personality, we'll fit in with the majority group. I don't know if I got it, Luis. You tell me what it is.
Yeah, well, I also want to see what one of the students has an opinion.
Yeah, I was gonna actually say the same thing, like being able to keep it like professional and like applying what you learned and like being socially accepted, and just how Virginia said, being able just to fit in public, but then also at the same time being able to like talk a different language with your peers, or talk Spanish, and you could kind of just see someone that you just relate with because you're from the same heritage, so you could just kind of go in between, like instantaneously, just from professional to at the same time, you could just talk and be who you really are, in a sense. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I mean, and that's all correct. And I just want to break it down a little bit further on why we have to do this, right? And so what I've noticed as an administrator, and I probably unconsciously recognize it as a student too, right? Because when we're doing presentations, we know that we have to speak a certain way for people to listen, because that's the way we're trained. And it's a colonized way of learning. And so what I've noticed as an administrator is that those administrators who speak white, who have that, also share that background and tell stories about doing white things, they get rewarded the most. And it's a sad reality. And sometimes, we have to code switch in order to be able to also be heard in meetings, be heard in front of a group. And so I'm doing that right now, actually, without subconsciously, because that's the way I've been trained, right, to speak a certain way. But I also try to keep it real when I can, because that's important too. That's how I grew up. That's, the Vallejo in me, that's the Chicano in me, right? And so it's important to understand that, yeah, code switching is a reality, and that it, that it shouldn't be, and it is tiring.
Did we lose you?
No, sorry, I muted by accident. And so, yeah, code switching, again, I just want to just say that it's tiring, it's needed, but we have to break that down eventually. We have to decolonize what it means to give a presentation. We have to validate our language, our way of speaking, our way of knowing. And I'm gonna try my video again just because I want to show you a book, because it relates to something that Diana had talked about. Something that I'm also consciously trying to do is decolonize my masculinity.
Ah.
And I gotta stop the video because I noticed that my voice is going in and out. But it's something that I'm consciously trying to do as well, because yes, in our culture, sometimes our masculinity we're taught a certain way to be. And as I get more attached to my indigeneity, I realize that our ancestors didn't work this way. They worked together. We uplifted each other as in different genders, and there wasn't only two genders, right? There was many genders identified within indigenous communities, and our community very much valued our two-spirit community members, as well as actually having more conocimiento, more knowledge. And so that's something to recognize as well. And as I was talking about my research, I want to mention 3 things that I try to live by, do my research by, and to incorporate in my life. And this was mentioned by Sean Wilson, who wrote this book called Research is Ceremony. It's called the 3 R's: respect, relationality, and reciprocity. Who wants to give it? I think we all understand what respect is, but does anybody want to give it a shot of what relationality may be?
Is it like just thinking about what other people, kind of like empathy?
A little bit of that, yes. Anybody else want to give it another? I mean, there's multiple layers, so and it incorporates that as well. Anyone? Looks like Isabella wants to say something.
I'm gonna guess relationality.
Yeah.
Your ability to build relationships. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, it's to be relational, right? And by being relational, it's kind of like it's a sense of responsibility to a relationship, and so that you also try to maintain that relationship by and there's many types of relationships, right? My relationship with my students, like being sure that I'm doing my part in my relationship, I'm doing my role, accomplishing my role in our relationship with our students, or with a friend, or with my colleague Virginia, make sure that I'm accomplishing my role as a colleague with Virginia, and so that when she does call, I'm following up with her, and which kind of goes into my next one, which is reciprocity. Is part of the 3 R's. So reciprocity means that every interaction, every relationship, everything you do benefits both parties, not just you, not just them. Because you also can't let people take advantage of you, but you also shouldn't take advantage of people. And it's not just people we have a relationship with, right? is plants, is Mother Earth, or as some people say, Pachamama, or in our Purepecha culture, we say Nana Echeri. Nana Echeri is our Pachamama. And so we also have a relationship with her that we need to maintain. And so being relational and being reciprocal with Nana Echeri is also important, not just with each other. And so these 3 R's is something that I am incorporating into my professional life, my personal life, and my academic life. And so I'm going to share my screen on my methodology so you have an idea of what I mean by that. Let's see. Can everybody see the this poster here?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. And so this is the presentation I had to do for one of my classes that talked a little bit about my methodology. And so does people know what methodology, axiology, ontology, epistemology mean to a certain extent? So really it's the way of being, the way of knowing, the way of doing research, which is a methodology, the way of doing, right? And so in indigenous methodologies, which can also be applied to the STEM world, right, is doing things with the intention of keeping things indigenous, right? The way of doing things indigenous. And so that reciprocity comes into research where we make sure that we have that that the research I'm accomplishing is not just benefiting me as a PhD student, but it's also benefiting the community that I'm studying. And it shouldn't be just me studying them. The students that I'll be doing research with are going to be considered my co-researcher, not my participants. And so being able to incorporate those students into the way I do research, what I'm researching, and my analysis of the research. And because again, we have to maintain that relationship, the relationality, that respect, and the reciprocity and without incorporating them into my research, how am I going to do the right thing? How am I going to know what their needs are and what their lens is? You know, what is their ways of knowing? Am I respecting their ways of knowing? And part of what I want to do is collective storytelling, which I'm highlighting here. I'm going to have open-ended questionnaires that incorporate indigenous knowledge. I'm going to make sure that it's elder-led, right? So I'm going to involve my elders, my Purepecha elders. And here in this photo is our Purepecha elder, Tata Jose. And so let me tell you about how I went about meeting Tata Jose. My wife and I were both from Michoacan. I met her in Oaxaca, but we were both from Michoacan. And we always talked about being attached to our Purepecha culture, because in Michoacan and part of Guanajuato and other areas, it was all Purepecha land, is Purepecha land. And I reached out to a couple people I knew, and my friend, Dr. Gabby Spears, who's Purepecha and grew up Purepecha, she connected me with Tata Pedro. Tata Pedro is more of a political activist in the Purepecha community. And Tata Pedro was the one that kind of did our premarital talks. And he connected us to Tata Jose and Ana Consuelo, which is Tata Jose's wife. And they're the ones that performed our ceremony, our wedding ceremony down in Pátzcuaro, Michoacán. And even though we had always hoped to be a part of the Purepecha community, this is the day of our wedding. We actually, they welcomed us into the Purepecha community via this wedding. And we didn't know that. We appreciated it, but we didn't know it going in. But it was very clear during the ceremony. They gave us a little bit of peyote that during that ceremony as well, and burned different herbs, including tobacco. And many of my family members and my wife's family members burned some herbs con un deseo, for our partnership. But the peyote, again, it wasn't used to go explore or do certain things. They gave us a very tiny amount so that we could feel the love of our loved ones that day. And it was very intentional in the way it was done. And ever since, we have had a really strong relationship, and it's been reciprocal. It's been respectful. And we wanted to make sure that as we're exploring our roots, that it was respectful every turn of the way. And that we're not culturally appropriating, as was mentioned by you all too, because that's very commonly done as well. I think many Chicanos don't mean to culturally appropriate, right? Because everybody's trying to learn their indigeneity. And I think maybe back in the day, I was probably doing cultural appropriation because I didn't know. I didn't know I was an Aztec and I wanted to be Aztec and all these things, right? Because I had no idea that there was all these different indigenous communities in Mexico. And so through this ceremony, they welcomed us into their community. We've been in touch with them. We've been visited them. They visited us here in Napa. We are helping kind of with fundraise for them as well. They're building a cultural center there in Santo Tomas, Michoacan, to further, I wouldn't say save, but because their culture is also in danger there in Michoacan, but further establish their roots there as with a ceremonial center. Let me go back to my methodology, because in that Temazcal was something that was just recently built as well. With this Temazcal that Tata Jose is in front of. And so I did participate in Temazcal with them as well, which is, does everybody know what Temazcal is here? So Temazcal is a sweat lodge of sorts. And so you gather around a circle and you enter a certain way. And usually you're cleaned by sage before going in. And outside of this Temazcal, there's a fire. And that fire, there's a bunch of lava rocks. Just give you a little bit of context. And if I had more time, I would actually show you a video about that. But these rocks are sitting in the fire as everybody enters. And the elders are leading the ceremony. In this case, Tata Jose and Ana Consuelo, they open up the circle. And many cultures have been gathering in circles for ages. And so this is one example of that. And then you're in there, they bring in 7 to 14, depending on the culture, lava rocks. And there's 4 rounds of this where they keep adding the lava rocks in there. And through each one, there's a purpose. And everybody in the circle has an opportunity to share what's on their mind, what's in their soul, what their intentions are for being there and receiving this medicine. Because a Temazcal is medicine, it's community medicine. And sometimes it's called for an intention. Let's say someone's sick, someone's ill. You can have a Temazcal to dedicate to that person, and everybody's collective energy is helping heal that person. But everybody also has a personal thing that they're healing, right? And so you're usually healing yourself through these periodic Temazcal. And so after each puerta, the doors open. Everybody gets to kind of release some of the heat that's been going, and sometimes when people step outside, and then another 7 rocks goes in. There's different herbs are thrown into the middle. They call it ombligo, like belly button, and that's where a lot of the medicine happens. Sometimes you throw a little bit of cedar in there, cedro, and the cedar is also cleansing. I use cedar in the men's circle that I'm part of as well, and we have a little fire, and I usually have a little bit of cedar and a little bit of tobacco on the side. Where we use the tobacco to give thanks. And anytime I see an indigenous elder that I'm going to go visit, I take tobacco with me because it's customary in the majority of indigenous cultures to give a little bit of tobacco to the elders that are welcoming you. And so I usually have a little bit of tobacco and a little bit of cedar and a little bit of sage. And even hanging, actually here, let me, I'll stop sharing. So I always like to have something nearby. In my office, I also have some sage, but in here I have some purple sage. And so when I'm feeling stressed, because this is where I study and I work, I do break off a little piece and I smell it. Sometimes it's burned as well to cleanse. But even just smelling sage is very important to me. In my office, I have a vase that's full of dry sage that my wife gave me intentionally because I was going through a stressful time at the time. And I kept it in there and I use it to smell. But I want to kind of stop there and just want to, again, go back to saying that practicing the 3 R's in my life in academia and in work is something I very intentionally try to do. And it is an indigenous way of doing things, and using my herbs and my plants and being grounded, growing my medicinal plants, but also our ancestral plants is really important to me. And that's something that if any of you are starting botany, maybe you should you could also look into ethnobotany and how different cultures use plants. And so I took an ethnobotany intensive 1-year course where I learned a lot about what I know about medicine now. And then it's been reaffirmed by my family and other indigenous peoples that I've gotten to know over the years, and including growing this purple sage and the white sage, and growing yarrow and other medicinal plants that are really good for us. But I want to open up, I know we don't have much time left. So I wanted to see if, if you do have a little bit of time, if you want to ask any questions, I'd be happy to address those as well. And I'm not in a hurry either. So, but I know if you have to go, I definitely understand that too. So if there's any questions, I'd be happy to field them as well, and just kind of have more of a discussion. I meant to have more of a discussion, but time definitely flies when you're passionate about something.
Yeah. So we do usually end at 2, but we're happy to have a little more time for this discussion. I do have a question for you. I do want to mention, if anybody has to go now, the SACNAS National Conference is coming up this next week, sorry. And so if you're interested in going, or if you are going, make sure you're all prepared for that. Enough time to attend several workshops. Virginia will be having a space accessible for all of us to check in and see what workshops are working for each of us, and we'll be collaborating. So we're always open to questions, but yeah, just email us if you have any questions in regards to that. Or yeah. So Luis, I have a question, because there is kind of pertains to a lot of things like environmental issues, immigration issues, but like when you're a small group, what do you think is the most effective way to communicate that need for change to that group? Because it's often the small group that can't do much about their position. How do you communicate that need for change to that higher power or people in charge?
That's a really good question. And first of all, I'll be at SACNAS as well next week. But by not letting your position, right, as a student, your role, get in the way of your work that you're passionate about. And as a student, you may not realize how much power you actually do have. They can't fire you. They're not going to expel you. And so you actually hold a lot of power you don't think you may have. And so by being loud, and by doing it with respect, relationality, and reciprocity, be loud. And again, this relationality may actually be the relationship to your culture, not necessarily with the person that you're speaking up to, even though you're supposed to be respectful either way. But by being loud, making sure that they understand this is important to you, because they do listen when students are passionate about something, and follow up, continuous follow up, because they know you're leaving. Eventually, you're leaving, and so if they think it's a hard time for them, they're gonna wait it out. And then third, re-energizing the rest of the group, especially those that are entering. So having that continuous connection with that cause. So it's a long-term thing, right? Strategy. It can't be a short-term thing. And so being able to re-energize the group that's coming in, continuously re-energizing them and saying, these are the issues we're facing. These are the issues we're pushing. We need your help. And writing letters to those that you want to speak to, depending on if it's in school. So again, I was relating it to school, but in your community, that's another way of doing it as well, is making sure that you're loud in your community. And the president of Consumnes River College, Dr. Ed Bush, also, it's one kind of gave me that idea in my head too, because I've been speaking up, but I feel like there's always times where I kind of also just step back. And Dr. Bush says, don't let your position get in the way of your, don't let your job get in the way of your work. And many times we do because we're afraid of getting fired or whatever it may be, taking those risks. But I'm over that now. I feel like it's the right time, especially right now with this ideological shift that's happening across the country, across the world. It's the perfect time to actually speak up. And Virginia and I are also doing that in the Mesa world to also uplift our program. I wonder if does that answer your question? Yeah.
Yes.
And it's a lot of work.
Yeah.
Any other questions you may all have?
I have a question. So, I identify as Latinx, Latina, and with the acknowledgement that I do have Indigenous ancestry. And when I'm in spaces like this, we all collectively share our own identities. Like we all know that we have all these, specific identities, and maybe we're similar or different, but I find it difficult or not like clear when I'm in groups of people where they, are not like me or not of color. And I don't make my culture like outwards. And I'm thinking maybe that has to do with some of that code switching where I have to, talk a certain way, act a certain way in order to sit there and be heard or participate. But how have you navigated being in a situation like that? So, for example, I think I've mentioned to somebody before that, I don't really put my culture that like forward that much just because it hasn't came up. But I'm pretty sure there have been times where like that need for somebody's culture input to be put in, and just I didn't do that, So how do you or are there any ways you can go about making sure that like you as a person and your culture is present? Because I still feel like I have to leave it at the door sometimes, and I want to work towards.
That's a really good question. And many times we do leave it at the door because we're trying to assimilate or fit in, right? And I think it's important to do what feels right for you first and foremost, because you also have to protect yourself, protect your corazón, your soul, because sometimes you can't always put it out there, right? Because people are going to do what they do. People are going to continue to speak white and be praised. All right, can you hear me better now? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, good. So people are going to continue to praise themselves and praise their whiteness, usually unintentionally, right? And you have to feel comfortable doing so. But there's going to be times where you absolutely find it necessary to speak up, right, and say that no, that is not right what you're doing. That is not right what you're doing and saying. It's I do identify as this, and I find that very wrong. And you don't always have to say your identities necessarily. You could just speak up, and speaking up is enough in itself. And I know a lot of us are still exploring our identities. I didn't just until recently actually say that I identify as Purépecha. It took me a long time to actually identify as Purépecha because I felt like an imposter. I felt like an adopted child to Tata Jose and Ana Consuelo. My wife and I both felt that way. But they call me Purépecha. They accepted us in the community, and they call my daughter Purépecha, right? And so I've embraced that identity, but I've long already embraced the Chicano identity. And so speaking up in those spaces is important, because if you don't do it, who else will? Especially if you are one of few in those spaces. And sometimes in the president's staff meetings, we're all these administrators are in the same room and talking to the president, and they say, oh, this is a lovely idea. And they're like, well, have you thought about incorporating race consciousness into that training? And they're like, oh, that's a really good thing. Everybody, maybe they care. Some of them may just say they care and say that, we should do that, right? But had I never said that, it probably would have never happened. I remember my first year at Napa Valley College at a president staff retreat. I had to say equity 10 times for it to make it as a priority on our campus. And again, there was other people that looked like me in the room, but nobody else was saying it. And sometimes it does take that one person that's like, it's just burning inside of you. If it's burning inside of you, that's the perfect time to say it. Even if it comes off wrong, it's better that you say it than not say it. And sometimes it's good to practice, right? And saying like, I'm gonna say it this way. I'm gonna, make sure that I'm trying to be as respectful as I can, and kind of practice it. But sometimes it just has to be said, right? And so if you feel like you're in a space that that your voice, the voice of your community needs to be represented, and you feel comfortable doing so, just do it. And again, but there's gonna be times where you're tired, you're stressed, and you also need to protect yourself and not do it. And maybe after that event or whatever that may be, that class, you go home and maybe you smell a little bit of sage to center you. And maybe the next time you're there in that space, you do have the desire to speak up, right? Because you're not always going to have that desire to speak up again, because you have to protect yourself, and that's okay too. Hopefully that answered your question. And if there's a follow up to that, feel free.
It did. Thank you. It's just, that's what I love about SACNAS is that we promote that here, where you can be one with your identity, but I still get this, anxiety when I'm not with people of my community. And it's just like, oh, how do I get over this small barrier? But it is very important that I make sure that like I'm comfortable and in the right headspace in order to do it. So thank you very much. That was very insightful.
And then in your generation, I think you're also fortunate that even our white colleagues, or many of them, are allies, and so they're only because they're ignorant on a subject doesn't mean they may not necessarily want to hear it, because they may want to hear it, and they might actually have your back if you do say it in class to a professor. And so it's also, you don't always have to carry your culture on the sleeve, but it's also important to show whatever pride you want to show it too, and be proud to have your culture, and even in all white spaces. And sometimes I do it very intentional. Sometimes when I know I'm going to be in all white space and I'm going to say something important, I'll wear this shirt. I'll wear, I will put my culture on my sleeve to show that I'm proud of it, and that what I'm going to say is important, and you better listen. Any other questions you may have?
Yeah, I wanted to know if, like, for me, I've noticed like a difference between many cultures. Say, like, my own, like in my own community, most people I know are like from Jalisco, Mexico, and then like my family, they're from Mexico City, and I see like a big difference in cultural practices. And I wanted to know if like you see that among like indigenous cultures in the Americas, like if there is a big difference in your beliefs and your practices, or even if there is like a sort of an appreciation for each other.
Yeah, that's a really good question, because it's a little bit of both. So one misconception is that many indigenous people here, that that many people consider Native American, do not appreciate the neighbors to the south, us, our indigenous ancestors, and that's incorrect. And I would say there's many similarities actually in the way that we do things in the but there's also a lot of differences between all the tribes in the Americas, right? So there's a lot of similarities and a lot of differences. And one thing that we must remember is that they have all been interacting with each other and trading with each other way before any European came and stepped foot here. And so they've adopted some of their practices a long time ago from each other. And it shows, if you do a little bit of research on, on a particular group, you'll see that there's some similarities. Even with Purepecha, there's still, people don't know how Purepecha ended up in Michoacan. It's still, some people think they came from up north. And some people think that they came from down south, because the Hopi and the Quechua peoples have very similar, a lot of similarities with the language, the Purepecha language. And so they've been, we're migratory people. We're nomads as well, and we're nomadic. And so there's a lot of those things as well. So I would say there are a lot of similarities, but there are also some respectful differences, right? And how different cultures do things. Some cultures were definitely more of a warrior type that did, kind of go and kind of expand their reach, but in a very respectful manner, incorporating everybody. I think, that's the difference between colonization and our earlier empires, was that, even if we took over that area, we still respected our differences. And where the colonizers didn't do that, right? They just took over and forced everything upon each other. So yeah, I mean, I would say there's probably a lot more similarities than you think between the indigenous cultures in Jalisco, indigenous cultures here in California, and indigenous cultures down in Mexico City area. And you got to also remember this was Mexico before too. And so but even before it was Mexico, these indigenous communities were going back and forth. And like the tobacco thing, it's across the board. It's a very common across the Americas in general. ¿Alguna otra pregunta? Some other question?
I personally have to get going. We can, somebody can mediate this if we want to continue going, but we can also offer that if you have any further questions, you can email us at our SACNAS chapter at SBCC, and maybe we can get in contact with Luis, and Virginia is also a resource. So feel free to contact us with any questions you have and check us out, check the conference out, and we'll hope to see more of you. Thank you again, Luis, for showing up at such late notice. We really appreciate that conversation that you had with us and letting us know how you yourself are bringing back your roots. It's awesome.
Well, thank you for hosting me. And I put my email address on there, and I am serious. Many people don't take advantage of that, but feel free to shoot me any question, and I'll be happy to continue this conversation at any time. And I don't see this as work. I see this as community building. So any point you want to reach out, please do. And I can talk to you about anything, but my path to engineering, my path to PhD, and all those things. So I'm happy to talk about more about the culture thing maybe. Okay.
So
Right.
no more lasting questions. I get to leave, but if you don't have a question, please speak up. Oh, it's getting some, we have some static.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, yeah, I have to get going, but thank you again. We'll look forward to keeping you as a contact, and I hope everybody has a great weekend. We'll see you next week at the conference. Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye, guys. Thank you.
Hi, everyone.